Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're tackling a really significant conversation happening right now, how LGBTQ plus topics are being discussed, or maybe should be discussed, in schools.
Yeah, it's definitely front and center in a lot of places.
We've pulled together quite a bit of material to try and get a handle on the core of this debate. We've got news articles, reports from groups like the Heritage Foundation, Alliance Defending Freedom, and even, interestingly, a Reddit discussion thread from RAS conservatives to get some, ground-level perspectives.
Right, so a real mix of sources, formal reports and more sort of casual online chat.
Exactly. And our goal here isn't to, pick sides or anything. We just want to unpack the key arguments and concerns being raised, get a clearer picture of the different viewpoints.
Makes sense, just laying out what the different sources are saying.
So let's dive in.
Okay. It's fascinating, isn't it? When you put these different pieces side by side, you immediately see how complex it is. You've got these legal arguments bumping up against really deeply held beliefs about childhood, about education, and then these very personal worries and anxieties playing out in places like that Reddit thread. It really shows all the different layers.
Absolutely. And one of the first big themes that jumps out, especially from that Heritage Foundation report, is this concept of gender ideology.
Ah, yes. That phrase comes up a lot.
It does. And the way they frame it, it's presented as a shift away from just teaching basic biological sex towards introducing ideas like gender identity and something they call sex assigned at birth. What do you think the significance of that specific framing is?
Well, from their viewpoint, it seems this shift isn't just neutral terminology. They see it as the deliberate introduction of a specific worldview. A belief system.
Okay, so not just facts, but an ideology.
That's the argument, yeah. And the report goes further, suggesting it's not just happening randomly. They claim, I think, to have found at least 16 states where this gender ideology is being actively pushed or inculcated is the word they use sometimes.
Wow. Okay, inculcated.
Yeah. And the examples they give really paint a picture of what they're worried about.
Right, and those examples are pretty specific. We're talking about things like schools putting up Young Trans Joy banners, hosting drag queen events, sometimes in school libraries, I think.
Yeah, those kinds of events. And also accusations about teachers using the classroom, the lectern, to promote what the report calls a radical ideology.
And then there are the complaints from parents about books, finding books in school libraries they consider pornographic.
Right. So it really paints a picture of this clash, like you said, between different values and expectations for schools.
Definitely. And a core worry within this gender ideology critique seems to be the idea that kids are being encouraged to separate their identity from their biological sex.
Yes, exactly. The report directly challenges the idea of being born in the wrong body. They present that concept as simply untrue.
So that really gets to a fundamental disagreement about how we even understand and talk about gender itself.
Precisely. It's a very basic difference in perspective.
And it seems like the introduction of certain sexual topics, ones that some people feel are inappropriate for younger kids, that's also being seen through this same lens, right? As evidence of this gender ideology.
It looks that way.
Yeah.
Which, brings up that tricky question of who gets to decide what's age appropriate when it comes to these sensitive discussions. It's not always clear-cut.
No, definitely not.
And to understand where they're coming from with this critique, the Heritage Report actually digs into some intellectual history.
Oh, interesting. Like what?
They try to link it back to critical theory, French postmodernism, Foucault, Derrida, and also later developments in feminism. They focus on how the meanings of sex and gender have shifted, especially in academic circles.
Academics. And they take a pretty direct shot at Judith Butler, don't they? The idea of gender as a performance.
They do. They suggest that while it's been influential, in universities, it may be based on shaky foundations. Their core argument against it seems to be, well, they see the concept of gender identity itself as either vague, poorly defined.
How so?
I use the term circularly defined at one point, or they argue it relies too much on stereotypes instead of, hard evidence.
So lacking scientific basis compared to biology?
That's the claim, that it doesn't have enough empirical backing to, as they put it, trump biology.
And when they do talk about biology, the report is very clear, very binary.
Extremely. They really emphasize the binary nature of sex based on gametes, ova, and sperm.
Right.
And they argue these fundamental biological differences lead to a whole range of other distinctions between men and women that they believe aren't just, made up by society.
That emphasis on the biological binary, that's a pretty consistent theme you hear in these kinds of critiques, isn't it?
Very much so. You often hear references to average physical differences, sometimes even cognitive ones, as evidence for these inherent biological distinctions.
The report also makes sure to mention examples of parents pushing back, like that situation in Fairfax County, Virginia.
Oh, yeah, over a sex ed plan that brought in gender identity stuff.
Right. It really highlights that tension between what some schools are doing and what some parents are comfortable with.
Definitely. And to show how they're actually identifying this gender ideology in school standards or curricula.
Okay. Yeah, how do they do that?
The report lays out their method. They look for specific things like, is there a clear separation made between sex and gender? Are terms like gender identity and sex assigned at birth being introduced?
Okay.
Do they perceive a downplaying of biological sex? And are words like cisgender, transgender, non-binary being used?
So it's really about the specific language and concepts being taught.
Exactly. They even point to the National Sexuality Education Standards.
Oh, yeah.
Mentioning recommendations like talking to kindergartners about the difference between sex assigned at birth and gender identity.
Kindergartners.
And talking to third graders about hormone blockers.
Third grade. Hormone blockers.
According to the report, yes. Those are the kinds of specific examples they cite that really illustrate the content causing concern.
And they argue it's not just happening in health or sex ed class either.
No, they point to other avenues too, like books available in the school library.
Right.
Social studies lessons, activities around Pride Month, even things like school policies on pronoun usage.
So a pretty broad scope.
Yeah. Their overall conclusion is that teaching what they call these gender dogmas is, quote, endemic in public schools.
Endemic. Strong word.
Yeah.
Okay, so that leads us nicely into the whole issue of parental rights, because that's a huge piece of this.
Absolutely central.
The other Heritage Foundation report, the one focused specifically on parental rights, brings up a policy in Escondido, California, an elementary school district, I think.
That's right. Escondido Union School District.
In that policy, basically, it says if a student asserts a gender identity, the school has to treat them accordingly. Just based on the student's word.
And here's the part that seems really controversial for some.
Yeah.
The school is explicitly prohibited from telling the parents about the student's transgender status.
Right.
Unless the student gives consent. What are the main worries about a policy like that?
Well, the core concern, coming from that parental rights angle, is that these policies are seen as, one, imposing a specific ideology on kids, and two, simultaneously cutting parents out of really important, potentially life-altering conversations and decisions about their own children. There's a strong emphasis in these arguments on the idea that children have a, quote, diminished capacity to make these kinds of huge decisions alone.
And they bring in legal arguments too, right? Supreme Court precedent.
They do. They cite cases that affirm the fundamental right of parents to direct the upbringing and education of their kids.
Like medical decisions, for example. Especially medical decisions, yeah. And the worry is that when schools facilitate what's called social transition, using a different name, different pronouns, letting them use different bathrooms, that these aren't neutral actions. The concern is they could put a child on a path toward medical interventions like puberty blockers or hormones, potentially without the parents even knowing, let alone consenting.
That connects to another point. They raise this reported increase in kids identifying as transgender.
Yeah, they talk about a precipitous rise. And there's concern. Sometimes you hear the terms social contagion or rapid onset gender dysphoria.
For GD.
That maybe social media or even these school policies themselves might be playing some kind of role in that increase. Though it's important to note those concepts themselves are subjects of debate in the medical community.
Sure. So the argument then is that policies preventing schools from considering a child's medical history or getting any input from parents are just fundamentally flawed.
Essentially, yes. Especially because the policies define gender identity as this internal, subjective sense. So they argue, how can you make decisions based only on that subjective feeling, ignoring parents and history?
And to back up the parental rights claims, legally, where do they go?
The report looks at a few areas. There's the common law tradition. They mention thinkers like Aquinas, Locke, Blackstone.
Okay, philosophical roots.
And then constitutional law, primarily the 14th Amendment, the idea of substantive due process.
In cases like Pierce v. Society of Sisters, that's the one about choosing private school, right?
Exactly. Affirming parents' right to direct education. So what's the core substantive due process argument they're making here with these gender policies?
Well, they bring up something called the shocks the conscience test.
Okay, that sounds serious.
It's a high bar in legal terms. But they suggest that school policies actively hiding a child's gender identity from their parents might potentially meet that bar. The argument is that kind of secrecy is just fundamentally unfair and deeply interferes with those established parental rights.
I see. And do they look at actual court cases challenging these policies?
Yeah, the report discusses a couple. Regina v. Staley is one, and Parents Protecting Our Children v. Eau Claire Area School District is another.
And how do those turn out?
It's interesting. Different courts seem to approach them differently, sometimes using a lower standard of review, like rational basis. Other times, considering the higher shocks the conscience standard, the outcomes have been varied for the parents bringing the lawsuits.
So no definitive ruling nationwide yet.
Seems like it's still very much being litigated. But the argument being made in these challenges is often that these confidentiality policies aren't narrowly tailored, meaning they're too broad and therefore potentially unconstitutional.
Got it. Okay.
So shifting gears a bit to get that more kind of everyday perspective, we looked at that Reddit thread, Rask Conservatives.
Right. What did that add to the picture?
Well, one of the first things that jumps out is just confusion, almost. There isn't one clear, agreed-upon definition of what LGBTQ education even is among the commenters.
That's a really key point, isn't it? What one person sees as just basic information or inclusivity,
right,
someone else might see as pushing a specific agenda.
Exactly. And quite a few commenters brought up concerns about a morality component they feel is creeping into the classroom, stuff they think just doesn't belong there.
Okay. Any specific examples of curriculum that bothered people?
Oh, yeah. One person had a really specific story about their kid's middle school biology class. Said the very first day of the sex ed unit was almost entirely focused on transgender identity.
Wow, day one.
Yeah, leading them to call it cult indoctrination. And a big source of frustration was feeling like they could opt out of traditional sex ed, but not this specific content.
Ah, that opt-out distinction. Why do you think that's such a big deal for them?
Well, I guess it comes down to a feeling of losing control, maybe, and the belief that certain topics, especially sensitive ones about identity and sexuality, should be handled by the family according to their own values.
Right, so the school not allowing an opt-out feels like an overreach.
Yeah, like the school is forcing a conversation they want to have themselves. And there were also just questions about why elementary school, why these topics, specifically with younger kids. Some argued schools should just focus on broad principles like respect everyone without getting into the nitty-gritty of sexual orientation or gender identity for little kids.
So the underlying worry seems to be that this kind of education isn't neutral, but it's a vehicle for a specific political or ideological viewpoint.
That definitely came across. And also this distinction between simply including LGBTQ plus people, like acknowledging they exist, versus what some perceive as actively privileging non-straight identities.
Okay, what does privileging mean in this context?
It wasn't always super clear, but it seemed to mean like focusing too much on it, making it seem more important or maybe even more desirable than being straight. Some commenters seemed okay with basic respect, but got worried when they felt an agenda was being pushed. One commenter even expressed this really strong view that some on the left are using LGBTQ plus issues as a tool to try and fundamentally change or even destroy the American way of life.
Wow, okay. That's taking it pretty far.
Yeah. But age appropriateness was definitely a recurring theme throughout that Reddit discussion, especially talking about anything sexual with young kids.
Makes sense.
Some argued, kids will figure out that gay people exist on their own eventually. They don't need explicit lessons in kindergarten.
Right. And were there fears about confusion?
Yes, definitely. Fears that kids might get confused about their own gender or maybe feel pressured somehow to transition. And then we also saw the very serious and controversial accusation of grooming being brought up in relation to the LGBTQ plus community.
Yeah. That's a highly charged term.
Extremely. And the presence of drag queens, particularly around children, was another point that came up repeatedly as something people were really uncomfortable with.
Seems like a real flashpoint issue.
For sure. But it's important, I think, to note that some commenters did try to draw a line. They distinguished between simply teaching that gay people exist versus what they perceived as promoting a specific agenda.
Okay, so nuance even within the conservative perspective.
Yeah. There was this sense from some that maybe things have gone too far, like an overcorrection, where LGBTQ plus examples are being, quote, bombarded at kids.
Bombarded.
But then others push back against the idea that conservatives are just automatically against gays. They argued their opposition was more about how these themes are presented, especially in kids' media and schools.
So the method, not necessarily the existence.
For some, yeah. But then you also had other voices arguing pretty strongly that promoting LGBTQ plus themes is inherently problematic, calling it unnatural and abnormal and potentially harmful to kids, families, society.
Right. That's a more fundamental objection.
Exactly. And that view was, of course, countered by others in the thread pointing out that homosexuality occurs naturally and has existed throughout history.
So debates within the debate.
Totally. It even got into whether just having a gay character in a story automatically brings extra ideological baggage with it. What do you think about that point?
Well, it really highlights how tricky it is to separate representation from advocacy, doesn't it? For some people, any visibility feels like promotion or endorsement.
Yeah, that seems right.
The thread also touched on whether society today is particularly homophobic, with different opinions on that. And someone brought up the distinction between indoctrination, which implies forcing beliefs on someone, and enculturation, which is more like teaching the norms and behaviors of a society.
Interesting distinction. How did that apply here?
Oh, I guess the argument would be whether teaching about LGBTQ plus issues is imposing a specific contested ideology indoctrination, or just reflecting the reality of diverse societal norms and enculturation. Depends on your perspective, obviously.
And for some, it seemed tied to religious beliefs, too. Like, teaching about these topics equates to normalizing sin.
That perspective definitely came up. Along with specific concerns about the medical side of gender transition for minors, puberty blockers were mentioned specifically as a worry.
Right. And this fundamental idea that kids don't inherently understand gender and can be easily confused by these topics.
And repeatedly, the emphasis on the parent's role. That parents should be the ones discussing these things with their children, when and how they see fit.
Yeah, that came through loud and clear. So, okay, as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, it's obvious we're navigating a really, really complex landscape here with LGBTQ plus education in schools.
Absolutely. No easy answers.
We've seen these significant concerns raised about what's being called gender ideology, worries about its potential impact on kids, really strong arguments being made about the fundamental rights of parents to guide how their children are raised.
Yeah, the legal and philosophical arguments there.
And then this wide spectrum of views from conservatives on the Reddit thread, showing everything from confusion and frustration to deep-seated moral or societal objections.
And balancing all that are, the equally strong beliefs on the other side about how important inclusivity is, about creating a supportive environment for all students, including LGBTQ plus kids.
Right.
And the idea that this kind of education simply reflects the diverse world we actually live in.
It really does seem to boil down to this tension, doesn't it? Between worries about ideological influence in schools, the deeply held rights and beliefs of parents, and this crucial goal of making sure schools are positive, accepting places for every single student.
It's got legal facets, social facets, ethical dimensions. It's hitting communities all over the country.
Yeah. Which kind of leads us to a final thought, maybe something for listeners to mull over.
Okay.
Given all these different values, these often conflicting beliefs and concerns surrounding LGBTQ plus topics in schools, how can communities actually talk about this? How can they foster dialogue that genuinely respects all these diverse perspectives while still working towards creating a learning environment where all students feel safe, feel valued, and can actually thrive?
Yeah. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. Definitely requires ongoing thought and hopefully some very open, if difficult, conversations.